Welcome to another huge episode of Triggered. Tonight's episode's going to be a fun one and also one that's going to have you questioning anything and everything about your government. Because today I'm going to be talking with Mike Benz. Mike is a former Trump administration State Department official, and he's an expert on the deep state's censorship efforts. This is a really big deal, and we're going to do a deep dive into all of it for you so you understand just how bad it is. You want to take notes on this one because it's going to be fascinating. We're going to get into the information. It's hard to believe it's probably worse than we all think, but let's just say it's worse than we all think. So guys, make sure you're liking, sharing, and subscribing so you don't ever miss these episodes. I'm only on Monday and Thursday, so it's not a regular thing that you get used to. Make sure you do that. And also, make sure you're sharing it with your friends so that we can get this message out. If you get your podcasts in a different way, remember, we download Triggered to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts. So if you miss an episode here on Rumble, you can check it out there. If your friends sort of get their podcast that way, send it to them. That is how we beat the algorithm. That is how we get it out there. That's how everyone can see this. So for all of the top headlines that we cover here on the show, also go check out my news app, MXM News, okay, like minute by minute, where you can get the mainstream news without the mainstream bias. We understand just how bad that bias is. We see it every day. So when they tell us to build our own, because we're sick of it, guys like me will get out there and we'll do just that. So if you could support us there, check it out. I think you'll really like it, and I think we can get through so much of the nonsense. And we're going to begin by taking a look at all of the top headlines, guys. And just so a little spoiler alert, under Joe Biden, everything just keeps getting worse, okay? Trump trade advisor Peter Navarro, who was on the show on Monday night, reported to prison on Tuesday. They are jailing their political opponents. He reported to prison on Tuesday, the day after our interview aired right here on Triggered. Peter was forced to go to prison because he didn't comply with a subpoena from the bogus January 6th committee. Remember, it was under appeal, but it doesn't matter, right? Executive privilege doesn't matter. It's good for everyone else, just not Trump. Just not Trump's China trade hawk. Peter is still fighting for what could be a historic legal case on the parameters of executive privilege. What was amazing about that interview, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest you go back and watch it, was Peter was still more concerned about what's going to go forward for the 2024 agenda than he was about going to prison. We need more great patriots like that. But here's the question, guys. What's going to happen to Hunter Biden for skipping out on the House Oversight Committee yesterday? Where's his subpoena? More importantly, will Hunter Biden face any consequences for lying to Congress? Tony Bobulinski laid it all out yesterday on Capitol Hill.
Mr. Bobulinski, was Hunter Biden telling the truth when he testified under oath that his father was never involved in any of his business dealings?
No, he was not. Those are all blatant lies.
Okay, so we are clear, folks. Lying to Congress is a crime. Congressional Republicans should at very least send a referral to the DOJ. Now, that's the same DOJ that Joe Biden has weaponized for the benefit of his family against his political enemies. I'm not expecting a lot, but as someone who's done 50 hours of congressional testimony, I know from the follow-up where, if there was a point of inflection in my voice, they tried to make it seem like it was a lie. I would have gone to jail. They tried very hard to do that. Remember, Adam Schiff up there wanted to try me for treason, a crime punishable by death. Even if they altered my emails, even if they messed with things, it didn't stop the media from covering it that way. But why is it different? Can anyone with a straight face say that I wouldn't be in prison if I did what Hunter Biden did? Of course I would be. And guess what? I deserve it. Yesterday's hearing just showed how involved Joe Biden was in all of Hunter's foreign business dealings. And remember, guys, foreign governments, those kind of people, they don't invest with crackheads unless they're buying them off. Hunter Biden asked his father to help get a deal done with the Chinese Communist Party, okay, a company linked to them. And he wanted to get it across the finish line. and Joe told Russian oligarchs to take care of his boy. Watch for yourself.
With Hunter Biden and Devin Archer at the Peninsula Bar in New York, where Hunter took a call from his father and told him things were going well with Henry's Allen Harvest, and that he might need a little help getting across the finish line. It was not the only time I heard Hunter speak with his father for business reasons. I was present when Hunter called his father on May 4th, 2014 on a cell phone, put it on speaker mode to have him say hello to Yelena Baturina, a Russian oligarch and an investor in Rosemont projects, and her husband, Yuri Luskov, the former mayor of Moscow. Devin Archer was also there. Hunter said, "Well, I'm here with our friends. I told you we're coming to town, and we wanted to say hello." The vice president said hello, some pleasantries, and I hope you had safe travels, and then said, quote, "Okay, you be good to my boy." Hunter responded by saying, "Everything is good, and we are moving ahead." The vice president said something about, quote, being helpful, and Hunter ended the call by saying he was going to call his father later. Before this call, Hunter sat next to Yelena Baturina at a table, and I heard him speaking on business matters generally. A few days after this May 4th party, an email my lawyer provided to this committee shows that Devin had confirmed Ms. Baturina was committed to a, quote, hard order of $10 to $20 million in a burden investment banking client.
Wow. I mean, hey, what else do you really need? But hey, it seems like that's never enough for the Democrats. You can have all the evidence imaginable laid out right before you, and it doesn't matter. You know, didn't stop them from pushing 3 years of Russia, Russia, Russia as though it was the gospel with no evidence, but we've been playing a different game for far too long. Now, Congresswoman AOC Ocasio-Cortez saw all of this, and she decided that she needed a memorable soundbite. So, what did she do? Well, she asked Tony Bobulinski if he ever witnessed Joe Biden commit a crime, and she didn't seem to like the answer she got back.
Your testimony today that you personally witnessed President Joe Biden commit a crime.
I believe the fact that he was sitting with me while I was putting together a business
Did you
deal,
witness the president commit a crime? Is it your testimony today?
Yes.
And what crime have you witnessed?
How much time do I have to go through it?
It is simple. You name the crime. Did you watch him steal something?
Corruption statutes, RICO and conspiracy.
What is it? What is the crime, sir?
You
Specifically.
You asked me to answer the question. I answered the question.
No.
RICO, you're obviously not familiar with. Corruption
Excuse
statute.
me, sir. Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir. RICO is not a crime. It is a category. What is...
No.
Of course, guys, RICO refers to corruption crimes. And given that exchange, I think we need members of Congress and Biden to all take cognitive tests. Probably especially AOC. Not the sharpest tool in the shed, but she thinks she is. However, the best part of the hearing came when Florida Congressman Michael Waltz, a friend of the show and regular guest, called out Eric Swalwell, the guy who slept with a Chinese spy.
And I find it incredibly rich. Mr. Swalwell is going to come to this committee and lecture us about how China penetrates our government. I think that's something he may know a thing or two about, but let's...
That was solid and true and ridiculous. And if it happened to a Republican, I have a feeling it wouldn't be a problem. Those people wouldn't still be sitting on the Intelligence Committee. But we live in bizarre times. Meanwhile, guys, Biden's open border invasion continues. In just the past few weeks, several terrorist illegal immigrants have been arrested. An illegal immigrant from Lebanon was arrested at the border after telling Border Patrol that he's a member of Hezbollah and hoping to build a bomb. He's telling them that. Imagine how many others are probably thinking the same thing, but are maybe smart enough to not put it into words. If he didn't get stopped at the border, he was hoping to get to New York. That's just who gets caught, folks. Last week in North Carolina, an illegal immigrant from Africa was arrested after a standoff with police. Turns out he too was on a terror watch list. There is a nonstop invasion of terrorists into our country under Joe Biden. Here's some of the numbers to illustrate just how bad this problem actually is. During the Trump administration, just 11 illegals on terror watch lists were caught on the southern border. So far, under Biden, at least 340 illegals on the terror watch list have crossed in from Mexico. And again, guys, the important question is, how many weren't actually caught? These are people who are well-funded by people who hate our guts. They hate our country, our freedoms, our lifestyle, and everything about us. I have a feeling they probably have more sophisticated ways of getting in, and when you have a Swiss cheese border, it makes it easy to do so. And here's footage from the border today, just today, earlier, that shows just how much of a disaster it's all become. Remember, folks, this is today, earlier in El Paso, Texas. Can you believe this? I mean, you think those people are going to be great in your neighborhoods? You think they're going to be nice to your children and play ball? Illegals are surging to our border while companies like Tyson Foods see it as a hiring opportunity. Tyson is reportedly laying off American workers while saying they also hope to hire asylum seekers. You know, asylum seekers. Everyone's an asylum seeker. If you want the freebies, you're an asylum seeker. Just check that box and we'll make sure to take care of it. They want to hire them for factory jobs that they claim Americans don't want. These are functionally illegal immigrants. They don't have visas. They're even offering legal representation as part of the compensation package. Wow, it'd be nice if they did something for Americans, but, you know, it's 2024. Who's going to do that other than Donald Trump? And meanwhile, the illegals who don't get a job at Tyson Food may just squat in someone's home. Think about that. They may just move in. A TikTok video is going viral right now from a Venezuelan illegal immigrant encouraging illegals to squat in abandoned homes. And believe it or not, beyond just illegal immigration, this has started to become a broader issue in our country with people taking advantage of squatters' rights. In fact, a landlord was just arrested in New York when she tried to kick out a squatter. Watch this one.
Just forced himself into my house. No, he did not. Yes, he did. No, he didn't. And so did you. You broke through the front door.
Officer. The man called the police on her.
So why is it that I have to leave and he doesn't have to leave?
Because technically he can't be kicked out. We need to go to court.
They consider this a landlord-tenant issue. And by law, it has to be handled through the housing court, not with police.
If you own this house, you would not want her inside.
I don't own it.
Exactly,
yes.
She does.
Yes, but then once again, you should know how the law works.
I do know how it works.
There's rules to the as you got to go to court and send me to civil court.
He says he signed a lease in October, but wouldn't tell us with who.
I got proof longer than that.
Show us the proof.
But who are you for me to show? I showed it to cops.
Dan with Channel 7 News. If you don't want to show it, you don't want to show it.
Proof. Come here, brother. I like that.
I would like to see it.
He didn't show me a lease.
This is a bill.
A bill for work he says he had done to the house. He didn't show police a lease either.
The police department doesn't have the lease?
No.
He's got no documentation.
Just bills.
So Adele, you're getting arrested right now?
I'm being arrested.
For what?
For being in my own home.
And where's your lease?
She's fighting the house. It's not her house anymore.
My deed is current and legal.
Arrested for unlawful eviction. She changed the locks on a man who claims he lives there.
Guys, property rights are one of the fundamental rights that built this country, and Democrats are destroying that. Imagine coming home one day and just having someone else living there. What would you do? When do we say enough is enough? When do we put an end to this bullshit? And honestly, it doesn't end there, right? The corrupt, out-of-control AG in New York, Letitia James, doesn't really believe in property rights either. She's now scheming to try to seize property from my father after the baseless and clearly corrupt fraud ruling that they got in New York in a hand-picked judge and in a courtroom where you're never going to get a fair shake, where Mar-a-Lago's only worth $18 million until it's not, and they can do whatever they want to manipulate the narrative for their own purposes, because who's going to stop them? It's complete madness. And frankly, it's time for the Supreme Court to step in to address what is a massive constitutional violation for excessive fines. Guys, these left-wing lunatics are corrupt, plain and simple, but they've gotten away with it. We do have some good news, though. In Ohio, Bernie Moreno won the Republican Senate primary on Tuesday in a landslide. This is a big win for the MAGA movement. It's a big defeat for the fake news media. Here's Bernie during his victory speech on Tuesday.
4th of 2026, we're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And when we have that celebration, we're going to talk about how freedom and liberty's back, government's off our back, and I'm going to end where I started. What is this party all about? People say, I've lived the American dream. Started a tiny little car dealership with nothing. Say, that's not really, in my mind, what I view as the American dream. Where's my father-in-law? I'm going to pick on him again today. Where is he? Dennis, where are you? You're tall. There's my father-in-law right over there, Bridget's dad. All right? Dennis went to high school in Hobart, Indiana. He was born in Gary, Indiana. Graduated from high school, reported to work at U.S. Steel. By the way, did you notice the name of the company? U.S. Steel? Because it's going to stay U.S. owned. All right? Goes to work there, was able to buy a home, buy a car, raise 3 kids, send them to good schools and safe communities, and he's able now to retire debt-free. That's the American dream. That's what's under assault, and that's what we're going to get back.
Well, guys, that's what it's all about. You know, we were told Bernie's too MAGA. He won't be able to win. And so we spent a little time. We did that, and he won all, I think it's 88 counties in Ohio by a 20-point margin. So remember, the MAGA movement, guys, it's alive and well. People get it. They see it. And we got to keep fighting. But lastly, here's a story that we'll talk about with our great guest, Mike Benz. A new study showed that Google has interfered 41 times in elections since 2008. Each time to help Democrats, of course. We know there's no way they'd actually help conservatives or common sense or anything that's not absolutely insane. But while everyone's talking about the dangers of TikTok and election interference, let's not forget that it's a provable fact that Democrats constantly collude with big tech giants like Google to interfere with our elections, with just a fraction, if any, outrage. I wonder why that is. It seems it's almost like they don't care as long as they get those results. But while you're searching, while you're getting your news, while it's entirely manipulated by Google and their algorithms, remember that. And that's why you should try to check out the other places and make sure you're not giving them your hard-earned money or pretending that they're going to be neutral arbiters in the information that you look for online. Go elsewhere. But before we get to Mike Benz, a quick word from some of our brave sponsors, people that you should support because they are not like Google. They are patriots. They believe in freedom. They don't just talk about it like it's a soundbite that they're laughing at a cocktail party. Sponsors like Public Square, the marketplace for the patriot economy, where you can go and find businesses and consumers who share your values. On Public Square, by going to publicsquare.com or on the app, you can put power behind your purchase and let your dollars reflect your values. Don't give your money to companies who hate you. Give it to freedom-loving companies who actually support you. And if you're a business, there's millions of consumers looking to find you. List your business on Public Square and move our country one step closer to defeating woke capital, woke corporate America. It's enough. It's time to fight back. You don't have to choose between what you buy and what you believe. You can choose between what you sell. You can choose who you're supporting, and you can put patriotic small businesses on the map and let them compete. So download the Public Square app today or go to publicsquare.com, check it out, and together we'll build the patriot economy, and simultaneously you can help save our country. Also, guys, some of the other great sponsors are actually right here at Rumble. Rumble Cloud Services has officially launched, and they're going to provide content creators and businesses with the products and services they need to succeed. Rumble has built the cloud for the parallel economy, so you don't have to worry about being canceled or being censored by big tech giants like Amazon and lose everything you've built. Okay, so exclusively for friends of Rumble, sign up today at friends.rumble.cloud. That's friends.rumble.cloud and receive 30% off the first 3 months of your cloud subscription, which is now available for purchase. And guys, like I said, it's an affordable service that is supported by independent infrastructure and not linked to big tech, so you won't get canceled by the woke mob. So again, head to friends.rumble.cloud and sign up today. Don't take your chances with the big tech giants who've shown that they are playing a very different game with our country. Guys, joining me now, cybersecurity expert, former State Department officer, and executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online, Mike Benz is joining us. Mike, how's it going, man? Oh. Mike, I think you're muted.
I'm muted.
It's okay.
It's
See,
going
I
great.
thought it was me.
Thanks for having me.
I was going to start
That's
firing
on me.
people over here, but it's just you, so I won't fire you because you're on the home team, so it's good.
That's on me.
How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, a lot going on right now, and it's sort of interesting as you think you probably have it all figured out, and it just keeps getting worse. The New York Times just came out with a big article saying that the deep state is kind of awesome. I mean, just a few years ago, liberals denied that the deep state even existed. Now they're saying it's awesome. What is going on here? I mean, is this just cognitive dissonance? Is this insanity? Is it just they don't care? What is happening? It went from total denial of this thing to, hey, this is their last line of defense, and it seems to sort of scream, contrary to all their complaining about, the affront on democracy that they sort of, I guess, ironically joke about all the time.
Yeah, the New York Times itself in 2021 published a piece saying the deep state doesn't exist and it's a big conspiracy theory. So, and then fast forward 3 years later, and to quote Seinfeld, it's real and it's spectacular. But it's bigger. It's bigger than just the sort of reversal of the New York Times. They've really fully merged with the CIA position. John McLaughlin, who was the CIA director for George Bush, came out a few years ago and said, "Thank God for the deep state." This is a position echoed by General Michael V. Hayden, who is the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, a four-star general. They all know it exists. They all know that their careers and their own personal piggy banks depend on it. It is the operation that permanent Washington basically moves through in order to make sure it gets its way no matter who's president. And we've had this permanent structure in Washington for the better part of a century now. And so I think what's happening right now in terms of the deep state, if you will, is something very similar that happened with the internet censorship story. If you recall, for about 5 or 6 years, it was a hard blanket denial. Internet censorship doesn't exist. Okay, sure, it exists a little bit, but it doesn't target Republicans. Sure, it targets Republicans, but it doesn't specifically, it's only because they commit disproportionate terms of service violations. It doesn't specifically micro-target the MAGA wing and Donald Trump supporters. Okay, it micro-targets Donald Trump supporters and MAGA, but it's a good thing. And, so we've watched that, that goalpost moving constantly, really in every sector of corruption that the Biden world has been involved with. And, it's basically a straight line playbook that you can predict the moment you hear an official denial.
So is the censorship getting worse? Has it, because so many people it's so obvious and so flagrant, is it forcing them to cut back, or is it just sort of like, hey, now that it's a big open secret, let's just keep talking about it? What is the censorship industry these days specifically? Yeah,
so I mean, there's good news on this front, actually. After losing this battle after battle for about 6 or 7 straight years, 2023 was a year of unalloyed victories. You had Elon Musk acquiring Twitter and creating basically a free speech bastion over at X. It's not perfect, but I think it's doing a very commendable job. You had the reinstatement of major accounts. You had the firing of about 85% of the censorship squads there, including the election censorship squad under Aaron Roderick's, who moved right on over to, who was a big part of this network from the legacy censorship folks. You had this pushback against advertisers who were a big part of these organized boycotts. You had the Republican response to the Disinformation Governance Board at DHS, which really activated a lot of congressional committees, from oversight to judiciary to weaponization to House Homeland Security, to all do their own censorship investigations, which have have resulted in subpoenas, hearings, investigations. You've had the Twitter files from Elon Musk. You've had the successful advance of the Missouri v. Biden Supreme Court case, a major July 4th victory of last year, which set the stage for the Supreme Court case that's playing out over the next several weeks here. You have major public interest law firms like America First Legal under Stephen Miller, who have been absolute bulldozers in terms of suing these censorship companies and getting records from them. Even X has been involved in suing these censorship mercenary firms now. X sued Media Matters, sued the Center for Countering Digital Hate. We are absolutely winning in terms of momentum for free speech on the internet. In fact, the New York Times just 3 days ago published basically an A1 front page top story Sunday edition New York Times piece that says how Trump's allies are winning the war on disinformation. And they actually named me 24 times in that report and blamed our whole coalition for, quote, winning successfully against censorship industry insiders on all fronts. So even what's been done with the rise of Rumble as a YouTube alternative, and the freedom of speech now on Twitter, which is the largest political thought leadership platform in terms of posts per day. You have this. I mean, you have these other tech companies who are now starting to actually open up their own terms of service as government pressure on them has gone down. In fact, so my job is to monitor the censorship industry all day and read all their reports and hang out in their live streams and things like this. And they've been apoplectic over the past several months that what Elon Musk has done with Twitter has actually resulted in Facebook lessening some of its censorship regulations. They're coasting on essentially the bravery of people who are building sort of free speech alternatives. And as they've been less able to bring that same level of government pressure because of the political blowback that it would cause, it's allowed the loosening of censorship on basically all platforms at this point, except
really, because
YouTube.
I'm obviously pretty vocal, but I see it on on Instagram. My engagement is just garbage right now because obviously I'm political. I do political things, and it's way down. Is it sort of one of these things where it's like, hey, relative to what it would have been before, I guess it's better. So we're, maybe we're making baby steps, but it ain't the same because it's almost
totally.
When totally. I'm obviously here on this platform. I do it in long form, but I'm not willing to cede any of the platforms. But I see my engagement on Facebook as well is down so much. It's like, unless there's something really worth talking about, I just don't do as much there because it's basically not worth the time and energy and effort to put it in there. Like, again, I don't like ceding any battlefield, but it's clear that it's not great. And so I'm curious about that. You see,
totally.
The Republicans are yelling, but a vast majority of the Republicans in Congress still take their $3,500 check from Google and don't really do anything in the end. And frankly, half of them that I spoke to, they don't even understand the issues, right? They're not dealing with the censorship. Like, I do my own social media. I post it. So when I see it, I know what it's going to do based on so I can say, hey, I'm getting 10% of my normal engagement. If I get a post that breaks 50,000 likes on Instagram right now, it's like solid. A year and a half ago, that could have been 300,000, 400,000. It's not even close.
Yeah, well, I mean, you are obviously a super high priority target. I mean, no mistake about it. They're still absolutely targeting, any influential figure who's associated with, sort of high level MAGA thought leadership. But, there's I agree with you. I don't want to give Facebook or Instagram credit. I'm only sort of relaying to you the frustration that many of the censorship industry insiders have felt around some of the loosening of restrictions around opposition to public health or opposition to the use of mail-in ballots, things that were hard, ban you for life things for talking about in 2020 and 2021, and which are sort of lessening at the toss level. But I'm sure that your account is hit with a do not amplify, deboosting, back end thing in order to try to stop you from being more popular.
Well, so talk about this. I'm seeing a lot, and sort of all of a sudden, the swamp is really lining up to ban TikTok. But I can't really help but think there's more to the story. I mean, I don't know if you saw, my full sort of opening monologue. But for example, a new study out reveals just how bad Google has interfered in our elections, going back nearly 2 decades. That's obviously clear. When I could search anything on Google, and you get the CNN version of the truth, for 37 pages before anything else would ever show up. It's clearly designed to manipulate. It's clearly designed to change the narrative. How do you see all of that? Because there's a ban for one that I see push up, but I see other offenders that are perhaps just as bad, and I'm not a fan of any of that, but just perhaps just as bad, if not worse, and for a much longer period of time. And yet no one, it's like, oh, well, that's different. It's okay.
Yeah, well, that thing about Google interfering 41 times in 16 years. They interfered 41,000 times in 6 months in the run up to the 2020 election.
I'd argue they interfere every day and every time you search anything that's even remotely political or health related or otherwise.
Oh, and it was all day one planning, literally day one. There was the November 8th, 2016 election of Donald Trump to the presidency. The very day after it came out, that was a Thursday. They held a TGIF Friday meeting on November 9th, 2016. That's their thank God it's Friday all hands meeting the day after the election. And so all of the major C-suite executives of Google, the CEO, the CFO, the COO, the CMO, are all on stage, and they're giving each other group hugs, telling each other, hug the person next to you. The CFO, Ruth Porat, who made $41 million a year, $45 million a year, was crying on stage and saying, cry into the shoulder of the person next to you. But Sundar Pichai, the current CEO of Google, actually prefaced what Google's strategy was to prevent Donald Trump's reelection at that meeting. He was asked a question by a Google employee, what can we do to stop the rise of alternative news who are swaying people, to vote the way they are for Donald Trump? And the CEO of the company replies, well, we're working on these new techniques involving artificial intelligence, using natural language processing. These are these weapons of mass deletion that I talk about, these AI censorship techniques that allow them to scan and ban tens of millions of posts rather than having to do, whack-a-mole, do things censor posts one at a time. And that was really the great game changer that allowed them to censor tens of millions of posts about mail-in ballots or anything that that opposed Joe Biden essentially in the run up to the 2020 election. But with respect to TikTok, there's a you got a strange brew, a sort of motley crew of commercial interests involved in this. This is one of these things where I understand the security concern around spyware in China, but we also have a national security state here who is fully mask off, weaponized against our own people. Yeah,
is Meta not doing the same thing? Is Google not doing the same? I'm not a fan of any of that, but it doesn't. Again, I think it'd probably be demonstrable to say, hey, in the grand scheme of America, given how long they've been around, those guys have probably done more damage, and yet we don't even talk about it in terms of how badly they're manipulating, what people believe and how easily they can sway these things. When you talk about elections that are won on by basis points, not even percentage points, it seems like it'd be really easy for again, Google or any of the others to do just that.
Yeah, it's hard to peer through the tea leaves of exactly what some of the machinations involved in this are because of the way that this bill is structured. It's not a TikTok ban. It is a divestment from ByteDance into non-CCP affiliated companies. But I could very easily see this being kind of a way to satiate sort of right-wing conservative anti-China pressure on Congress and to satiate the commercial interests of Facebook, Google, and other major tech companies, while simply transferring ownership to a new set of equity holders who themselves, I could see if Sequoia Capital, for example, gets involved in this investor crew. Well, they've got major links to, they're technically not a Chinese, large asset under management financial firm, but they have major links to Chinese investors. If they end up sort of swapping it out, so it's now sort of a Sequoia Capital held rather than ByteDance held, well, then that quells the public pressure around Chinese spyware, but it simply turns it over to the same commercial holders, but basically puts a pretty U.S. face on it at a time when so many of these U.S. entities have these backdoor partnerships with China anyway. So to me, it's not quite clear what this compromise bill on taking on TikTok is actually going to do in terms of moving that needle. But that remains to be seen.
So, how do you get that same sort of level of pressure on Congress to go after, the Facebooks of the world and the Googles of the world? Do they just control too much and they can manipulate the data so badly that it's almost, futile? Because what do you do about the bigger problem? Because the bigger problem is that the guys that say out there do no harm are doing a lot of harm.
Well, you referenced this yourself when you mentioned the paychecks that members of Congress get from Google.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was in 2021, Google officially became the largest corporate lobbyist on the Hill. I think they overtook basically major pharma companies and oil companies as the number. I don't know if they still have that spot, but I know they certainly held it for
I imagine
a time.
It's close. Even if it's not number one, I imagine it's close. Right. It feels like Ukraine's probably number one right now, but after that, it's got to be a close second.
Well, Viktor Pinchuk, the Ukrainian oligarch, was the single largest donor to the Clinton Global Foundation. But
of course he was.
There's and Google is a top 5. I think it's number 6 right now by market cap in terms of how big that Goliath is. But you have this going back to that day one plan on November 9th, 2016 at that TGIF. Thank God it's Friday Google meeting about what to do about this election that just happened the night before. One of the questions from the audience, from the Google employees who are 98%, Democrat in terms of their partisan affiliation, one of them was, hey, do we as a company now box out the Republican Party as a show of protest, against the Donald Trump election? And again, the response from the Google C-suite was, actually, we're going to go in the opposite direction. I think this was Kent Walker, the chief legal officer, who presented this. He said, we don't want to be left out of the conversation on the Hill. We're actually going to probably be more involved with the Republican Party now after this election, but we are going to do that with a means of swaying them. And that's exactly what, I'll post the clips of this actually on my X account after this. It's at Mike Ben Cyber, just so everyone sees this. It's amazing. They talked about this all day one, but that's exactly what they proceeded to do. In fact, there was there were the CPAC conferences during the Trump presidency where Google was one of the major sponsors. I don't know if it still is. I didn't check in over the past 1-2 years, but they absolutely made good on that. And in fact, Breitbart published a bunch of internal leaks of Google folks talking about the specific reason and arguing against their own employees. No, we're not supporting Republicans just by paying Republicans. What we're doing is we're lobbying to get them to vote against their own interests.
Yeah, well, and it's sort of interesting if you break down and you look at some of those donations, you link them to people who, honestly, you'd probably say, hey, they're pretty good on our side. And yet, let's say they're a lot better with sound bites than with reality. So, right. It's sort of what you get a lot of, where it's like, hey, they're still taking the check. They say the right things on TV. They say whatever it may be there, but they don't actually ever push anything that's going to get these other companies in check. And so, I think we have to do a better job of holding our own people, even those who we probably say, hey, they're great. There are a couple names on that list. I was like sort of shocked. I'm like, man, I thought he was really good on the issue, until you realize like you're really good on the issue, but you don't actually do anything about it.
That may be changing, though. I definitely agree with that as it was from 2016 to 2020. I mean, in the first 2.5 years of Trump's presidency, we had a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and the executive branch. And we actually lost on the censorship issue, despite having Republican control over all three branches. I think the amount of ground up pressure right now on members of Congress from the base is pretty extraordinary right now on the censorship issue, as the collective acknowledgement of how bad it truly is has permeated, virtually all Republican voters. Even in the early stages of the censorship industry's formation from 2016 through 2020, it proceeded piecemeal, right? It started with things like hate speech. You said, oh, it was only these bigots and extremists. And then it was, disinformation. Okay, it's only if you're sort of adjacent to the Russians or something. And then it started to be like, okay, mail-in ballots, that's really, that's really weird. But I guess I don't really have a problem with mail-in ballots. And then it got to be, just basically anybody who had more than a couple thousand followers, found themselves tanked on all platforms, and it became, unavoidable. And so, the fact is despite Republican control of the House from 2016 to 2018, there was no congressional investigations, no subpoenas, no hearings on Google's role in censorship, in Facebook's role in censorship, in Twitter 1.0's role in censorship, while they were setting up the censorship industry, and while they were banning or throttling hundreds of thousands of pro-MAGA accounts. The House itself, whether that was from lobbying money or whether that was from a lack of collective consciousness, the main thing right now is the collective consciousness, I think right now, is rising in a way that is allowing political action to be feasible now that was not before. And that includes the use of state attorney generals. Ken Paxton in Texas has brought suit against the State Department. The Attorney General
they tried to have judges that would remove his ability to look into things like voter fraud. I mean, they tried to remove that stuff from the Attorney General because they understood that he's one of the guys that will actually fight it, as opposed to some other Attorney General who will do nothing and may say the good sound bites, but it doesn't actually mean anything.
Yeah, well, Google was doing all of that re-ranking that you were referring to. From that article in 2017, in mid 2017, Google launched something called Project Owl, which is a way to basically kill all access to alternative news on Google searches. They use something called authoritative sources. Mind you, this is not authoritarianism. It's simply only showing posts from authoritative sources, and that meant basically
it's like the use of Wikipedia as the gospel according to BS.
Right. Exactly. And so it was basically a scam. It was a cartel. They set up basically an OPEC for news. Yet if you were a part of the club, you got to be a news producer. If you weren't, you were kicked out of the #1 most trafficked website on the entire internet, and you were kicked out of the #2 most trafficked website on the internet, YouTube, by proxy. And so, that all happened in 2017. If we had a higher level of collective consciousness then, those Google executives should have been dragged in for transcribed interviews by a weaponization type committee, or by a House Homeland Security type committee, or by an oversight committee. At the time, whether that was lobbying money or whether that was a lack of collective consciousness or lack of internal political pressure to do it, it wasn't being done before. But there is a lot of it being done now. And again, that it's being effective because the New York Times is saying it's effective. The Washington Post has written 3 pieces this year bemoaning people fleeing the field of disinformation studies. But I will say, I brief members of Congress fairly frequently, and I do get the sense that they feel the pressure to, even when they personally disagree with funding going towards censorship institutions or being stuff in these bills, they do feel pressure from party leadership to pass those bills, even though they oppose the money going to the censorship industry. So there's still a lot of work left to do.
So, we obviously, people have a good understanding of sort of what the deep state is and what that means, but you often refer and use the phrase the blob to describe intelligence corruption. Talk about the blob versus the deep state and what that all means.
Yeah, so that term was actually coined by Ben Rhodes, Barack Obama's deputy national security advisor, when he was describing the Obama administration's battles with permanent Washington. And it's a very useful concept. It refers to the foreign policy establishment. So we basically have 2 sets of citizens in this country. We have the citizens of the American homeland, that's here in the continental, U.S. plus, Alaska, Hawaii. And then we have this great big American empire, and the class of people within the U.S. government and the stakeholders on the private sector side who are kind of the managers of the American empire. So you have this distinction between the citizens of the homeland and the managers of the empire. And throughout the entire 20th century, the foreign policy establishment had this license to do dirty tricks abroad in other countries in order to secure the interests and a middle class, welfare for the citizens of the homeland. For example, in 1948, we renamed the War Department to the Department of Defense. We established the Central Intelligence Agency. We began rigging elections all around the world. We rigged the Italian election in 1948. The CIA wrote a memo 12 days later and said, hey, we needed to do this, and we need to do this basically in every plot of dirt on the globe because it's a big, bad world out there, and we want to make it the American century, and we need a professional Department of Dirty Tricks. As long as it's not used against the American people, it'll be in their interest. And you can make the argument that the foreign policy establishment, the blob's dirty deeds abroad is why we had cheap gas, is why we had these export markets for American steel and copper and aluminum. It's why we had, access to rare earth minerals. It's why we were able to have multinational corporations, because any government who opposed them would have the State Department come down on them and pass sanctions, or the Pentagon go in and take a certain territory that with its natural resources, or the CIA go and overthrow the government or control their internal media ecosystem. Those are sort of the three main sort of stars of this show. It's the Pentagon, the State Department, and the CIA, the intelligence community, if you will. And then their corporate and financial donors and drafters on the outside of it. So those will be, the blue chip multinational companies and the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the sort of, Wall Street, George Soros, Bill Browder class. And those forces have a lot of sway over personnel who gets plucked into the Pentagon and State Department and intelligence services. But the main thing about the blob is it was given these foreign-facing Department of Dirty Tricks powers in order to be able to overthrow governments in the name of democracy. And then a funny thing happened on the way to the election of Donald Trump, which was they lost control over the internal affairs of the homeland. The blob had serious control over the media in the 20th century. You can make an argument that even mass media itself, yellow journalism, which really started during the Spanish-American War, was in league with the War Department in creating the predicate to invade Cuba and to take the Philippines. This is basically what Citizen Kane is about, that the sort of Hearst media empire. And then you had the entire mainstream media apparatus that existed at the time in print and in radio and in early TV rolled up into the Pentagon's Office of War Information in 1942. And then you had all the veterans of all three of the big three media channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS, were all Office of War Information veterans for the, basically the progenitors of broadcast TV media were, had this backdoor Pentagon channel. You had the famous Operation Mockingbird with the CIA having, 10 to 12 editorial slots on the New York Times and 800 proprietary media outlets around the world, the so-called Wisner's Wurlitzer from the 1950s to the 1970s. You can go into the CIA reading room right now and read the CIA media task forces from the early 90s talking about how they still have these media relations and how they're so effective at being able to kill stories. We just saw this 2 weeks ago when the CIA invited the New York Times onto top secret, not declassified military bases on the outer edge of Ukraine, just so that the New York Times could print a story putting pressure on Mike Johnson not to refuse Ukraine funding. There was always a backdoor until internet freedom got to a point of maturity where citizen journalists could outperform legacy media in terms of swaying hearts and minds. And when that happened, we're living in this period of the revenge of the blob, where they're trying to reassert in the digital realm the kinds of control they had over media that they had in the 20th century.
Because it's interesting, you said, Ben Rhodes from Obama's administration actually had a problem with it, because it feels like whether it's the blob or the deep state, they so much seem to be doing the bidding of the Democrat Party and are much more simpatico, to that sort of, crazy mindset these days. But I guess it transcends all of that, and it's just about power and control. Or that's sort of interesting to me, because I look at those guys as being the people that are actually in control.
I don't look at it as a Democrat thing at all, actually. I mean, it obviously is manifesting itself as overwhelmingly Democrat at this moment in history, and there's the reasons for that have to do with how Trump rose to power. Essentially, Trump didn't just knock out the Clinton dynasty; he knocked out the Bush dynasty. In fact, in a way, he was more cruel and severe to the Bush side than he was to the Clinton side, insofar as, repudiating everything that was they were ever famous for. The Iraq War, the militarism and focus on foreign interventionism. I talk about this a lot. When I talk about the Yankee Cowboy War that existed between in the 20th century, you had this divide between Democrats and Republicans where you sort of had this Yankee class for the Democrats, which was sort of high finance from Wall Street and London. And then you had that sort of stretching into this Northeast corridor power sector. And then you had that pitted against this sort of cowboy Republican class of military, energy, and Chamber of Commerce companies. And they were jockeying for junior versus senior position for the entirety of the 20th century, basically from Truman until Trump, when Trump came along and knocked them both out, which basically forced them into an alliance with each other in order to oust domestic populism. And it is domestic populism. I mean, I have no doubt that if Bernie Sanders had stuck to his 2016 guns and had somehow made his way into the presidency, that this would manifest itself as a sort of GOP CIA led thing rather than a DNC one, in the sense that they went after Bernie very, very hard and played a lot of dirty tricks on him because he was arguing against war funding. He was arguing against foreign interventions because he wanted all the money that was going to the Pentagon and the CIA and the State Department to go to fund universal health care and free tuition in colleges. And this is something that we saw in the 1960s and 70s as well, when you had this very strong anti-communist CIA, oil industry, Chamber of Commerce blob capacity, which was overthrowing left-wing governments around the world. And then in the 1960s and 70s, they started to do that against rising left-wing populist movements who were anti-imperialism and were anti-war, anti-Vietnam. And so the CIA started interfering in Democrat Party politics. And you had factions of the DNC. You basically had a DNC civil war. And then you had almost all of the Republican Party on board for doing this. We're living in sort of the inverse of that right now. And look, I mean, even at the beginning of this segment, when we talked about the New York Times. It's all about power, huh? Well, when we just talked about the New York Times saying, the deep state is totally awesome. And I mentioned John McLaughlin, the CIA director, who said, thank God for the deep state. And I was saying, name the difference between the CIA and the New York Times. Well, John McLaughlin was George Bush's CIA director. Yeah. Michael V. Hayden was George Bush's CIA NSA, 4-star general. Liz Cheney led the January 6th sham, charade there. This is about the blob and its spoils. Yeah. And the problem is when MAGA came along, it reduced the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party down to a tiny little fraction of the power it once had. And so it went running over to the DNC in order to basically lend the resources that they have in the military, the resources they have in the energy space, the resources they have in the Chamber of Commerce to create this, kind of DNC dominant coalition that manifests itself in the mass censorship and indictments of Trump affiliated populists, not Republicans writ large.
Yeah. So what do you expect to see censorship wise this election? What role will the Supreme Court's decision in Murphy versus Missouri have in the future of censorship or government collusion with people who are willing to censor or, the big online agencies?
Yeah, so the censorship industry right now is in the middle of a restructuring. They took a lot of body blows last year, starting from late 2022 into the current moment, where the initial role of the government was the quarterback of something that they called the whole of society counter misinformation model, but it's just censorship. They're not countering it through counter speech. They're countering it by having all these different institutions do their part in censorship. And those 4 categories of institutions are the government, the private sector, civil society, which means the NGOs, the universities, the nonprofits, the activists, the researchers, so to speak. And then the 4th one is media. So again, you have government, private sector, civil society, and media all working as one in order to execute censorship consensus ideas and to put pressure on the various other institutions in society in order to effectuate that, whether that's through ad boycotts, whether that's through changing terms of service and whatnot. And the U.S. federal government was really the quarterback of that whole of society from 2018 through 2022. Nobody really knew what it was doing, except a very small handful of people. It had not been scandalized. It had high hopes to be able to scale that ad infinitum, to be able to control citizen discourse on every sensitive policy issue. But then it suffered, again, these sort of body blows over the past 15 months. And so they're restructuring it right now to, instead of having the government sort of play the number one quarterback role, to stuff, basically do an elaborate laundering operation where they have the civil society organizations function, the sort of NGO class function as the government, and imbuing those NGOs, stuffing them with government officials, stuffing them, with all the capacities that used to be inside DHS, that used to be, strictly inside the Pentagon or the State Department or the National Science Foundation. And so, they're trying to basically restructure the censorship industry so that the government's role is less visible, but it still reflects the whole of government consensus. But really where it's going to come down to is, how much of every bit of laundering they have to do makes things less efficient from their side. It means they need to guard their communications. They need to speak in code. They need to set up little shell companies. They need to move things around and do funny business with how money moves. It makes it less efficient than just being able to have one email from DHS, activate 100 different censorship mercenary firms in the censorship industry, 60 different universities who are all on the payroll of the government, and 120 different.
But they're still going to try.
Oh, absolutely, and it's a professional job now. This is something that they've argued. Trying to get rid of internet censorship is like shutting down a coal mine in West Virginia. It would put too many Americans out of jobs. I mean, they literally argue that it's their livelihood now. You can't take it away from us. But it's going to come down to some of the new tricks that they're doing. They're expecting, they're ready for a not great result at the Supreme Court level, and they're counting on two things at this point, which are the boomerang, the transatlantic flank attack I call from Europe, which is this new NATO censorship law, which if U.S. social media companies like Rumble and Twitter want to keep a European market, they're going to need to comply with these new disinformation regulations. And then the second one is state level censorship laws. You have one by one, I think there's been 4 or 5 different blue states just this year who've passed these sort of state level censorship laws around so-called digital literacy or media literacy. So they're moving into other organs of state power as they're losing control over the pure federal government.
So, when you talk about, I've seen you speak about the Transition Integrity Project. What is that exactly? I understand the House Oversight Committee is actually launching an investigation into the group. From my understanding, it relates to some sort of domestic color revolution. But what is it, so people can be on the lookout? Because it seems some of these things that are going on sort of under the scenes that are negative, people just sort of they cover it up, they hide it, and we'll never actually hear about it.
Yeah, it's really one of the craziest scandals in American history. So, you mentioned that, a lot of people refer to it as being a domestic color revolution incubator. And just to flesh out what that means, we just talked about the blob, how we imbued, starting in the 1940s, a Department of Dirty Tricks power within our CIA, within our Pentagon, within our State Department to be able to overthrow foreign governments in order to pry open their markets, take their natural resources, control their internal media, make them vassal states of the U.S., as we see was done in Ukraine. We overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014. We installed, a new prime minister, a new president there.
What could go wrong?
We then took, control over their shale resources. We then privatized their companies. This is a tale as old as time. We've been doing that for 80 years, but we have a playbook for doing that, which is sometimes referred to as a color revolution. This is named after the sort of color-coded. There's 2 ways to overthrow a government. One of them is through a military coup, and this is the way things were done, sort of the 1800s, early 1900s, which is, the military has the guns, so you just bribe a sufficient quorum of the military generals, and they just roll in with tanks, take the palace, and then boom, you have a new government under military rule. That was the classical way of overthrowing governments. And then a new technique was developed in the 20th century to be able to, instead of a top-down military coup, to do a bottom-up, people-powered revolution, which is basically involves destabilizing the country, depriving the government of financial resources so that its police and military are unable to control protests, and then creating mass street protests and walkouts of all the industries, and using those protests as sort of a functional military unto itself. And so the end stage of a color revolution looks like 200,000 people surrounding the Parliament building, running the president out of office, running the elected officials out of office, and a new democratic state, which is evidenced by how many people are on the ground, takes control of the government. This is, for example, what happened in Ukraine with the so-called, Euromaidan, square. This was the Maidan revolution. This was the major square near the Parliament building where hundreds of thousands of people on U.S. State Department payroll. Victoria Nuland said that the State Department pumped $5 billion into those groups and then activated them as a rent-a-riot the moment the democratically elected president Yanukovych refused a IMF trade deal. But this is what we did to overthrow Milosevic in Serbia in the late 1990s. Slobodan Milosevic was a group who was ousted in one of these color revolution things. Again, we had 100,000 people who are on U.S. payroll, who are working with these trade labor unions, who were collaborating with the Central Intelligence Agency. The State Department paid those political opposition protesters $77 million to do this. And it goes a long way in a poor country, by the way.
Yeah.
And so, this ability to do mass rent-a-riot protests, grinding the government to a halt, and then in the crisis of that, saying, well, this president has no legitimacy, and that because it's all the street muscle of, everyone on the ground wants. You see what the people want because they're in the streets, and this is a very special set of skills that our blob has. We've done this in about 85 different countries over the past century. It's hard to find a non-NATO ally that we haven't done this to.
Yeah.
And the thing about the Transition Integrity Project is it was consistent of the exact same class of people who do that task. That is, Rosa Brooks was the head of it. Rosa Brooks was a senior Pentagon official under the Obama administration who had a CIA blue badge. It was a bunch of four-star military generals. It was folks like John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager and now is in charge of the largest slush fund in the U.S. government, a $370 billion energy slush fund to pay off essentially Biden cronies with virtually unlimited amount of taxpayer funds to do so. And what they did is, this is in June 2020. This is right around the time the mail-in ballot voting process was being codified, and we knew that was the way for the first time in American history that there'd be universal mass mail-in ballots. There had been scandals around mail-in ballots since the Civil War. I think in the 1862 election, there were scandals about the use of mail-in ballots. It had never been something.
I was told it was the safest and securest election ever.
Well, you were told that by Chris Krebs at CISA, who was simultaneously running the government's censorship control center. Yeah. This is one of the dirty underbellies of that whole story, is that the cyber agency in charge of administering the election was the same agency in charge of censoring the election, and the tens of millions of social media posts that they pre-censored in advance in order to stop the delegitimization. This was the terms of service that the federal government forced on all of the major tech platforms: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, Reddit. They had 15 different platforms that they forced to install this terms of service policy called delegitimization. Now, mind you, these are professional election delegitimizers.
Yeah.
Right? They are the ones who led Russiagate. Russia just had an election earlier this week. No matter what you think of it, you can go to every single one of their Twitter accounts right now, and you will see them saying that was not a real election. That was not real. These are professional, but they understand the importance of creating a sense of delegitimization to be able to overthrow, to be able to because these color revolutions take place often immediately after elections, when they use the argument, well, it wasn't a fair election, so we should be the new government, because it's unclear, how the results went, but we know who's the government, who the people want, because the people are out in the streets. So this group of this hodgepodge of CIA, military, State Department officials, plus their political stakeholders on both sides, because Donna Brazil, the former DNC chairwoman, plus Michael Steele, the former GOP, RNC chairman, were both a part of the Transition Integrity Project. Now, again, that's basically the Democrat Party. Head of the Democrat Party and the head of the Never Trump wing of the GOP teamed up with the Blob in order to simulate a domestic color revolution if Trump were to win the election. So they ran
how involved was this around, like, even J6? How much of the blob was involved in sort of pushing this notion of, a violent insurrection? I mean, it's the first violent insurrection in the history of the world that no one was armed, except for the tour guides. I assume it's all part of the same thing. It feels like, the story about the bombs at the RNC and the DNC disappeared faster than they would if they weren't successful in their other endeavors. The whole thing, none of it adds up.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because, the Transition Integrity Project ran 4 different tabletop simulations, role-playing, how to make sure Biden was the president no matter what happened. And these involved Trump. Scenario 1 was like Trump loses, but he doesn't leave office. Scenario 2 was like too close to tell. Scenario 3 was called, quote, clear Trump win, which meant Trump wins the Electoral College. He wins it by so much that we can't contest it. How can we still, orchestrate a sort of domestic color revolution where they openly contemplated, the George Floyd riots had just broken out in May, and this was held in June. And they specifically, in their own scenario 3, discussed how they could use Black Lives Matter as street muscle, and what favors they would need to do for the Black Lives Matter movement in advance of November, what they need to do in the next 5 months to ensure that they would answer a call from the Biden campaign to take to the streets. So this is basically an open, color revolution call to arms. If they took one step in furtherance, if they sent one email in furtherance of that plan, then that's 10 years for conspiracy, basically a conspiracy to, obstruct a federal proceeding, and probably another 10 years for conspiracy against rights. It's the exact same thing that they accused 20 Trump lawyers of being involved in Georgia, except on absolute steroids. They even contemplated the alternate elector scam that forms the basis of that Georgia suit. But the other thing that they said, which is interesting, is part of the plan that they had was to, quote, induce a breakdown on January 6th. They actually mentioned January 6th in the TIP Color Revolution simulator, that they would provoke a breakdown in the ratification of that day, and essentially use that chaos to say, well, there's no ratification of the votes, and so Trump won't be inaugurated on January 20th because of the mess around January 6th. And then there's a lot of very strange issues with January 6th that we could get into, obviously. That's even TIP openly contemplated several references. This is in June 2020, about the ways that they could deny a Trump presidency by inducing a breakdown in Congress that very day.
So, we spoke a little bit about artificial intelligence at the beginning of the interview, but will AI fuel this information warfare? I mean, how fearful should we be of AI, or can we actually use it as an asset? I mean, do we on our side, not sort of controlling tech, do we have a chance of actually, utilizing it for good, or are the powers that be that control it so far gone that it's really more of a threat than anything?
Well, it's important to note that AI is already here. This is not, AI with respect to drone technology or Neuralink type stuff, maybe this sort of far off, fanciful, might happen, might not. But with respect to internet censorship, make no mistake. I mean, AI censorship was rolled out by Google's Jigsaw. Basically, Google Jigsaw is basically Google's CIA branch. It was actually created by Jared Cohen, who was the guy who was Condoleezza Rice's, basically special operator within the policy planning staff at the State Department. He came up with something called the doctrine of digital statecraft, which was, it was a young guy who was brought in at like 26 years old to be able to provide the older fuddy-duddies at the CIA with what the kids are up to these days, because youth street muscle is such an important part of regime change operations. The CIA will frequently work with student groups or young people, because those are the ones who are more willing to take to the streets. They've got more energy, they have less to lose, they have more to gain if they have promised to be a part of the new government post-coup.
It feels organic.
Right. And so this is a tale as old as time in terms of, so he was a guy who was working with youth movements and then was brought into this coordinating center between the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency. And he came up with this idea of doing revolutions over social media. In the 20th century, these revolutions were all orchestrated out of U.S. embassies and consulates and CIA station houses. He said, well, listen, all the young people we want to recruit right now, in 2008, he was coming up with this doctrine, and he was saying they're all on Facebook, they're all on Twitter, they're all making YouTube videos. If we want to get 100,000 people on the street, we can just do it with a hashtag. You don't need to run, black duffel bags with unmarked bills to a couple leaders who give it to 12 lieutenants, who give it to 100 people, who give it to 1,000 people. We can do this. We can do rent-a-riots on steroids simply by running it out of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And this doctrine was credited with causing the Arab Spring, which is where one by one, all these adversary governments of the Obama administration, Tunisia and Egypt, the whole Middle East, sort of North Africa rim there, were all toppled using Facebook and Twitter revolutions, which were intermediated by, State Department funds and USAID funds and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout. But this exact guy, Jared Cohen, who came up with that and was credited with basically kicking off the Arab Spring, his very next job was at Google Jigsaw, which was a one-person think tank. It started out just to how to, use Google's proprietary resources to solve complex geopolitical problems. And, Julian Assange called this the moment that Google became the shadow State Department. And Google Jigsaw, right after the 2016 election, took this DARPA technology, this Pentagon technology that was created to be able to do speech detection of ISIS groups. Because in 2014, ISIS was said to be recruiting on Facebook and Twitter. The DARPA had this big program for being able to take the dialect of ISIS supporters, what prefixes and suffixes they use, what hashtags, what words, what slang, what rhetoric is associated with this belief system. This is a technique called natural language processing. And Google Jigsaw took this Pentagon military technology for being able to mass survey and mass censor ISIS terrorists and deployed it straight on MAGA. In fact, the very first iteration of Google Jigsaw's Perspective AI, which was the first retail weapon of mass deletion, was trained on 3 models. The Trump movement around the 2016 election, the Brexit movement around the UK referendum, and the third one was just generic climate change. But then that came to be scaled and used to censor COVID, to censor dissent around the war in Ukraine, to censor abortion issues, immigration issues. There became a pop-up censorship mercenary firms in the AI space because this became basically there was a gold rush for who could be the best weapon of mass deletion developer, in the same way that there became a sort of gold rush during the Manhattan Project period. And after we dropped 2 bombs on Japan in World War II, we didn't stop there. The weapons technology development continued with hydrogen bombs. And, for 10, 15 years afterwards, we were still, developing that. And, there's ultimately got to be some sort of nuclear disarmament with the use of AI censorship, because the tool is so powerful that it can be used as a sort of God button to completely kill any sort of dissent, which is why the State Department loves it so much, by the way.
So what should a second Trump administration do to combat, this kind of stuff? If you had the power, can that come from the president at this point, or is it too far gone to actually? Do you need more than just that even at this point?
What you could do with a single pen stroke is basically copy the template that was used by the late Trump administration around DEI. If you remember, I think it was like October 2020 or something. It's pretty late in the game, but Trump passed did an executive order around, I think it was around federal contracting for companies that had these crazy diversity programs that were hugely discriminatory and had an immediate impact. You had tens of thousands of these DEI consulting firms who were immediately cut off from their corporations, because the corporations could no longer qualify for government grants and contracts because of their association with these discriminatory organizations. You can do the exact same thing with AI censorship. You can say anybody who uses NewsGuard's, machine readable AI censorship scripts, anybody who uses Logically AI's, AI censorship superweapons, anybody who uses Google Jigsaw's AI censorship superweapons. I mean, there's tens of thousands of these groups now, because there's been $1 billion in DARPA and National Science Foundation funding into all of this. I mean, this is actually the subject of a congressional investigation just a month ago. Jim Jordan's committee did subpoenas into the National Science Foundation in an 85-page report on this. Dan Bishop's House Homeland Security Committee did a full hearing on this. They spent $100 million just on funding AI censorship superweapons to target Trump supporters, COVID critics, and other sort of heterodox groups targeted by the blob. So, I mean, you could do the same thing with one pen stroke. The fact is if you were to get rid of government funding in this space, it would, if not collapse overnight, it would basically topple the Jenga tower, because this is not an organic market. This is something that
it's totally, it's artificially created too.
Right. Yeah, it's a subsidized market. And if you get rid of those government subsidies, you collapse the market, and it'll still be there a little bit. There will still be some enthusiasts, so to speak, but unless their arm is twisted by the mafia, or should we say just the Biden world, they're not going to use it as a commercial choice.
Wow. A lot to think about there. That's pretty scary, Mike, but I appreciate you breaking sort of all of this stuff down for us. Obviously, as some of this, comes back out and more of it sort of manifests itself, we got to have you back on, because I feel like we could probably spend an hour going down each one of these individual rabbit holes, but it's pretty amazing. Can you let our audience know where they can find you, where they can see your stuff, they can follow and sort of just educate themselves as well?
Yep. So the best place is on X at Mike Ben Cyber. I post like 30 times a day there. All reports and everything go through my X account. I do have a Rumble account. It's Mike Ben Cyber, and I sort of use that as an archive for a lot of the videos that I do. And my foundation is foundationforfreedomonline.com. We publish investigative reports around the intrigues of the censorship industry.
Well, Mike, really appreciate you being on here. Like I said, we'll have to do that again, because, man, it both scary as hell, but a lot to unpackage. And I think the more we're actually talking about it, the more people understand just what's going on, just how badly they're being manipulated, just how powerful it is. Hopefully wakes people up and they start actually combating it. So thanks so much for being here, man. Really appreciate it.
And chin up. We have momentum now in a way that we never had before. So if there's a white pill at the end, I think it's that. But thanks again for your time, and would love to run it back.
Likewise, man. Thanks again. And guys, that was great. Make sure you're liking, you're sharing, subscribing. Okay, make sure you're passing this on. Remember, you can also get the episodes here on Spotify, on iTunes podcasts. Make sure to go check out our great sponsors. Download the Public Square app today, or go to publicsquare.com and join the Patriot economy. Find businesses that share your values. Support small businesses. If you're a business yourself, find consumers who want to fuel that and are sick of fueling the woke corporate juggernauts that are doing so many of the things that Mike's been talking about. Also, for the same reasons, go check out Rumble Cloud Services. Sign up today at friends.rumble.cloud and get 30% off the first 3 months of your cloud subscription, which is now available for purchase. But doing it through Rumble as opposed to Amazon or one of these other companies that hates your guts is going to make a huge difference. So guys, make sure to check out the sponsors. Make sure you're liking. I see how many people are watching live. I see where the likes are. It ain't the same. It doesn't take all that much. It's not a lot of effort. If I can do this, you can do that. So do that, hit it. And for those of you who are on locals, I'm going to head over there and do my AMA. Right now, I will see you there, and you guys be well. I'll see you on Monday.